Serving as moderator, Jesse Holland is a colleague, an assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW. He is an award-winning journalist and has won multiple awards for his fiction and nonfiction writing, including The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African American Slavery in the White House. Professor Holland also serves as a guest host on C-SPAN's Washington Journal. And he's a great colleague and an inspiration to our students. So thank you, Jesse, for agreeing to serve as moderator for today's discussion. Yes, please. To Jesse's left is Liliana Mason, who is an associate research professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University's SNF, Agora Institute and Department of Political Science. That is one heck of a mouthful. I don't know how you say it on a regular basis. She is author of 2 highly influential books that have helped lay the groundwork for today's discussion. Those are Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity, and Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes and Consequences for Democracy. Thank you, Lily, for joining us. Next, we have Denitra Walker. Dr. Walker is an award-winning television news journalist and journalism scholar at the University of Georgia who focuses on race and media. Mainly through qualitative methods, her work captures the experiences of marginalized and underrepresented journalists in the digital age. She covers social justice, activism, police shootings, maternal health, and has a growing interest in racialized mis- and disinformation. Denitra is truly one of the up-and-coming young stars in our field, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have her here. I turn then to dear friend and colleague Dana Gell-Young. Professor Young is a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware, where she studies the content, audience, and effects of non-traditional political information. Her book, Irony and Outrage, examines satire and outrage as the logical extensions of the respective psychological profiles of liberals and conservatives. Her current book project, Wrong, How Identity Fuels Misinformation and How to Fix It, looks at how our mediated political world fuels asymmetric wrongness. Dana is absolutely powerhouse in this space, who is, I know, an incredible inspiration to many of us. And for the students in SMPA, you won't get through the program without reading her work. So, Dana, thank you for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Molly Ball, who is an American political journalist and writer. She's the national political correspondent for Time magazine, and previously she covered US politics for The Atlantic, where she won the 2012 Toner Prize for Excellence in Public Reporting for her coverage of the 2012 United States elections. In 2019, she received the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency for her coverage of the Trump administration. And Molly's reporting is, I think, among the best in this field, particularly in her coverage of the presidency. I've long been an admirer and am doing a little bit of fangirling here, standing to her left. So please help me welcome Molly and together this incredible panel. Jesse, I turn it over to you.
Well, first I want to welcome all of you here for this important conversation. And we also want to say a thank you to Brian for that great keynote that brought up many of the topics we're going to talk about here today. But we also want to say thank you to Rebecca for putting all of this together. We wouldn't be here without her. First and foremost, I don't want to make the mistake that Brian just talked about and start in the middle of the conversation instead of starting at the beginning. So I'm going to start with the question that has us all here and get each one of our panelists to actually answer it. I mean, In the United States, we've been through so much. We've been through 2 wars with Britain, war with Spain, Whiskey Rebellion, the attack on Congress in Philadelphia, Civil Rights Movement, Jim Crow, all the way down to January 6th. So why is democracy in a crisis now? Why do we actually think democracy is in a crisis? And I'll start with you, Lily. Is democracy in a crisis?
Yeah. I think one way to think about it is to go back to the 1960s, which was a time of real social upheaval, and there were protests and there were actual political assassinations. I mean, it was a really chaotic time. But the important thing about that period of time is that the parties, our political parties, were not on opposing sides of that chaos. And so as a government, as a 2-party system, we could have chaos in our society, but the parties weren't organized around it. And after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, we started to see a lot of very disaffected white Southern Democrats who didn't really like the Democratic Party anymore. And the Republican Party took advantage of this and gradually over decades brought them into the Republican Party. They also took advantage of an emerging Christian right movement that had previously been non-political and was becoming political. To the extent that now what we're seeing is the Republican Party embodying largely, white, Christian, rural, traditional American values, and the Democratic Party, having to be everyone else, and in fact, the Democratic Party being the only party really pushing for a much more multi-ethnic democracy, pluralistic democracy. And so the chaos that we're seeing now is organized by our politics. The parties, when we vote, we're voting for an image of America that looks like it did in the 1950s versus an image of America that we've never truly really seen before, that's even more, more representative and more equal. So the danger to democracy comes from that. When we're voting, we're not just voting on tax policy, we're voting on what does America look like and what will it look like in the future. And those are the types of arguments that we can't compromise on. And that creates a place of real stoppage in our politics.
Denitra, are we in crisis right now, given everything that we've been through?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree. And I'm gonna, just kind of talk about a lot of the conversation goes with power. So even when we didn't even realize that democracy was in crisis, it was. And for whom, right? There's a power dynamic. So even when we're talking about journalism and how it's, the first, we're talking about how journalism started and how people were reporting on certain things. What were they reporting on? Who was in the newsrooms? Where was the power, right? And so when we talk about it now, it still exists, but at the same time, it's almost like we're not just talking about the people who don't have power anymore. Now they have voices. And we're looking at the changing dynamics of society. But, at the end of the day, yes, it is in crisis. And I think it's more salient now because we have social media and we're talking about it more. And I think a lot of people weren't talking about these things. It was not something that you would say. And our country is very young, whether we admit it or not. And at the end of the day, when we talk about all of these different dynamics that come into play, it has always existed. And I think now people are starting to feel more empowered to say it. At the same time, some people have been more empowered to voice their views. And so journalists are trying to cover these different topics. And at the end of the day, it's like, how do you cover them? So yes, it has always existed. And in my honest opinion, it will always exist, unfortunately, because the more you take power away from someone, and we've been having these conversations, the more they're going to fight to keep it. And so our democracy is really at a place where we're trying to figure out what's the next step. None of us have the answer. And so now we're sitting up here and there's a lot of really smart people, really trying to find answers to how we can all move forward like a kumbaya moment. But at the end of the day, we have all these different things that are happening, all these different points of views, and a changing dynamic with our demographics. And yes, it's going to continue to be in crisis for a long time until we all, or to a great majority, admits it. And then we can start to think about moving forward.
Dana?
So I'm going to do what I usually do, which is take what Lily's already said and then build on that. So Lily's work on the social sorting of our political parties over time, I think, has been so hugely influential in our field because it helps us understand political discourse right now in terms of identity and the increasing importance of social identity. That it's not just that we're voting for a particular slate of issue positions and policy positions, but that our political party has become this sort of proxy, this umbrella that encompasses how we worship, what we look like, where we live, how we spend our free time, and what our fundamental values are. And so that has created an America of today that has a problem of political sectarianism. And the way that I approach this as a communication person is from the standpoint of how our media and social media economics and logics are tailor-made for the kind of fragmentation that political sectarianism offers. Because our media organizations, cable news, social media algorithms, Facebook pages and groups, all of these things make such efficient use of our multi-layered political identities in ways that just distill those identities. And we're reminded all the time of who we are, how we think, how people like me behave, and how we talk, and how we outgroup other people. And that distillation process is exacerbated in a way that I don't think that we have seen. And so I'm not putting all of those eggs in media's basket, but there's a synergy that's happening that is particularly destructive right now.
Molly.
Hi. Well, like most things, like most issues, I think as a reporter, it's important to me to be somewhat agnostic on this question. And to consult experts like you all to weigh in on this question of whether there's a crisis in democracy. I think worldwide, it's clear that there is what's been called a democratic recession, right? If you look at the Freedom House rankings of governments around the world and how many of them are to some degree democratic or not, that's a number that's been going down for many years, and I think that's a big problem. Do we have a crisis in democracy in the United States? I think we need to think about what we mean when we're asking that question. And, it is not a crisis for democracy that Donald Trump won an election, and it is not a crisis for democracy that Donald Trump lost an election. And I think when a lot of people in polls answer that question, that's what they mean, right? I think for a lot of liberals, it was a crisis for democracy, just that Trump could get elected and be president. And for a lot of Republicans today, it is a crisis for democracy that they believe the election was stolen, which obviously is not true. So whether our democracy is functioning, to me, is a question of, first of all, do we have a representative government in which people can choose their leaders? And so far, that's working out okay. It obviously got a little bit hairy on January 6th. But the system held, the institutions held, and we do have a system of representative government where most people still go and vote and believe that that vote counts and believes that the person who wins the election is the one who got elected. And then I think the other question about whether we have a democracy is our political system successful at mediating our national disputes in a way that they do not degenerate into violent conflict? And there, I think there's reason to worry, because we did just, for the first time in American history, not have a peaceful transfer of power. We had a transfer of power, but it wasn't peaceful. And there's a lot of warning signs about whether Americans are willing to continue to use the democratic process to mediate their disputes, or whether they believe that the situation is too desperate and they have to take up arms. That's really scary. That would be but I do think it's important to keep this all in perspective. I find some of the commentary about this a bit hysterical because, arguably we didn't have a democracy in this country until the Civil Rights Act, right? Mm-hmm. And so people's ability to vote, universal suffrage, people's ability to have a voice in their government. It is easier to vote and harder to cheat in almost every state in the country, despite some of the legislation that has been proposed in some states in recent years. It is easier for people to have a voice in their government than it has ever been. So, all of this is relative.
I'll stick with you with this question, Molly. Given what happened on January 6th, like you said, we had for the first time a non-peaceful transfer of power. And now we're coming up on midterm elections and a presidential election, which will start the day after the midterm elections. Should journalism change how we have covered democracy and elections and voters based on what we saw on January 6th? What should we change? And if we should change, how should we change?
Well, I'm again going to say yes and no. But look, on the one hand, yes, anytime the political landscape changes, we should adapt to that. And this is a new sort of issue set that you see a lot of newsrooms adapting to, right? A lot more coverage of things like voting rights, a lot more coverage of things like violent right-wing extremism and the potential threat that it poses, a lot of coverage about things like disinformation and radicalization and all of the trends that we see. So I think that there's a natural and a good tendency in the media when something happens to then continue to try to explain to people or figure out for people what caused it and whether it's continuing as a problem. But does that mean we should, change our whole approach to the exclusion of everything else, and it should be the only question that we ask, candidates or voters, and every story we write about the midterms should only be about, whether this candidate denies the election, blah, blah, blah. No, I don't think we should do that. Most people see their vote in the midterms as a vote about the future, and I think that's up to them. It's their vote, and they should use it how they see fit. So, if the majority, you look at, I was just in Georgia where Trump tried very hard to take out the governor and the secretary of state for not going along with his attempt to overturn the election. And they, sort of kept their heads down, went out to that same Republican electorate that thinks the election is stolen and convinced them that other things were more important. So I think it's our job to cover the elections that are actually happening, in which that may not be people's highest priority, whether the last election was stolen, and portray for our readers what it is that people do care about and what it is that actually the election is turning on.
Dana, what do you think?
So my sense is that I'm going to answer this a little bit differently because I feel like there are things that have become sort of staples of election reporting over the last 30 years that my field has been complaining about during that entire time, that have catastrophic implications now, far greater than 30 years ago. So the big one that everyone has heard me talk about forever, along with Tom Patterson since 1992, horse race framing and strategy framing and reporting. So that is coverage of elections in terms of who's ahead and who's behind, public opinion polls, talking about campaign choices in terms of, this candidate visited this group of people because, it is a strategy to try to, get the vote up with soccer moms in, the suburbs of Philadelphia, blah, blah, blah. So now that's always been something that we have known is probably problematic. And there's empirical evidence suggesting that that enhances political cynicism. It causes people to think about politics in terms of strategy, and no one is actually doing anything because they think it's the right policy. They're just doing it to try to get a vote. It also has been shown to, in some circumstances, reduce turnout and reduce trust in government. All of those things are bad. Now, I would say they're even worse, because if you are talking about strategy, horse race, or also called game framing, now you're also running the risk of emboldening and legitimizing authoritarian populist candidates. Why do I say that? Because a strategy framing and reporting treats candidates as personalities. It is the spectacle of the race. It doesn't actually deal with issue positions or policy platforms or evaluate how feasible some of their ideas are. It really is just about the personalities. And so if you happen to be a candidate that does not have a platform, hypothetically, then you are going to benefit disproportionately from reporting that's going to talk about, I don't know, you perhaps being an underdog, et cetera. So I feel like the cost of the strategy horse race frame is greater than it's ever been. So all of that is to say, yeah, I do think that journalists should do things a little bit differently right now, but they probably should have been doing that differently 30 years ago too.
Denitra.
So I'll say this. And we've had these conversations about when a person's under deadline, they're not thinking, I'm using this frame and I'm using that frame, right? So let's be honest, I never thought about that. And most of these conversations, at least in this tone, I didn't really hear from this angle until I got here. And when I say got here, I mean became an academic, right, scholar. So one of the things that I think about when I think about should we do things different, the answer is of course, but it's how. So I think of strategy. So when we're thinking about how we should reframe, not just reframe the way journalists do their work, we should also think about how to tell them to do their work in a way that's not extremely disruptive to their newsroom structure. We know the newsrooms are shrinking, if I can get the words out. We know that journalists come from different backgrounds all around the country in different newsrooms that have different points that they like to put out. But at the end of the day, how do we have a one-size-fits-all message to journalists of how they should cover elections? We have a lot of unprecedented things that are happening. So now, what are we doing to not just talk about this, but to get the message out to journalists in a way that they can easily digest it as well as do better? Because we talk about accountability. Yes, we definitely want to be accountable to not making sure that this person is, the horse race frame, right? This person is ahead. Well, that's easy. I worked in television. It's real easy, and I'm not, making an excuse for it, but it's real easy to put this on. It's the easily digestible information to hurry up and put on as well as a poll. But we can and we should do better. And I think that comes with guidance from some really smart people, as well as the input from journalists, as well as in our schools, when we're talking about training people who are media makers, because we all are media makers, to Brian's point, but also how we can move forward with this with everyone being on the same page, which is things need to change, so let's talk about how to change it.
Lily.
So I think that there's a problem that's common to journalism and American political science, which is this norm of nonpartisanship that is drilled into us for years and years of training. We are trained not to prefer one party, not to ever publish anything that suggests that one party is better somehow than the other. And for a long time, it was possible for us, I'm speaking now of political scientists, but this also applies to journalists, it was possible for us to be three things: truthful, nonpartisan, and pro-democracy. And we are supposed to be all three of those things. What happened, particularly during the Trump administration, is that we could no longer be all three at once. And a lot of, at least political scientists, felt like we were now having to choose between being nonpartisan and being pro-democracy, or truthful. And so lectures that I had given 10 years before that had not come across as partisan at all, during the Trump administration all of a sudden sounded partisan because I was talking about the importance of a free media, for example. And so changing norms is a really hard thing to do, and it's happening very slowly in political science. It will be hard for it to happen in journalism, but at some point we have to be able to say, when we are truthfully talking about what's happening in the country, that on some things you have to take a side, not necessarily a partisan side, but we were talking earlier, after January 6th, all of the media agreed. That was bad, right? All of the media that we were reading said that was a bad thing.
Not all.
No,
Well,
sorry.
I was going to jump in there as
Not
well.
the right wing, not right wing.
In the immediate seconds after January 6th, everyone said it was bad.
That day.
The day after, the story changed.
Because it was Antifa.
For some media.
Yeah, right. But taking a stand to say January 6th was undesirable and anti-democratic is an important thing for the media to be able to do. And something, as we were discussing earlier, the question becomes then, what other things are so important that journalists would take a side on them, right? If we're talking about taking voting rights away from women, for example, right? Do they take a side on something like that? Not because they're Democrats or Republicans, but because we're talking about losing actual rights in our democracy. And so it's a really tough question. It will require probably years of training and thinking about how we train journalists and political scientists. But I think that the norms of nonpartisanship were built for a different time, when our parties were basically equally committed to democracy, and we're just not at that point anymore.
I had all of these great questions I was going to ask, but then Brian gave his keynote, so I'm going to steal his questions and ask the panel. But I also want to say that I've learned as a journalist, we don't always know the right questions to ask, and there's always someone who can ask a better question. I'm saying all of this to say there's going to be a microphone out there somewhere. If you have a question you want to ask this panel, there's going to be a microphone going on, and I'm going to leave time near the end for you to be able to ask your question. Because once again, I've learned that we as journalists don't always ask the right questions or know the right questions to ask. So I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk to our panel and ask a better question than perhaps what I would have. But once again, I'm stealing this question directly from Brian's keynote. As Americans, our job is to defend our democracy. Is that our job as journalists, to actually say, this is bad for democracy, this is good for democracy? Isn't it our job as journalists to be neutral observers? Can we be neutral observers when it comes to whether our government is in crisis or not? And I'll start with you first, Molly, because I know you're going to say yes and no. So I'll give you a chance to jump. I'll give you a chance to say that first, because that's how I would have answered it as a journalist as well.
Well, my question is why? What is the point of having individual reporters standing out there saying, oh, by the way, this is bad? Like, why do we need that? Because I think, most people reading the news since Donald Trump started running for president would not think that the worst problem in the media is that they weren't hard enough on him, that we weren't hard enough on him. I think it was very clear to most voters that here was someone who, had a difficult relationship with the truth and did a whole lot of precedent-shattering things and was not necessarily invested in a lot of our institutions, including the institutions of democratic governance. So the idea that we somehow needed more, sort of finger pointing from the media to inform people that, by the way, this is bad, I just am not sure how that would have helped. And again, it's not a problem for democracy that Donald Trump won an election. And I do feel like there is an undercurrent of a lot of this coverage that feels like, well, the media failed because people voted for Trump. And I don't believe that at all. People can vote for whoever they want. It's our job to inform them. And if they decide that knowing all of these things, and the majority of people when they went to the polls in 2016 believed that Donald Trump lied a lot, including a lot of his voters. And they decided that, they still wanted to vote for him. And that is, it's never our job, in my view. I mean, for opinion journalists, perhaps, but for straight reporters, it's not our job to tell people who we think they should vote for. It's to give them the information that would help them make an informed choice according to their priorities, which are up to them. We don't get to set their priorities. We don't get to say to voters, you're supposed to care about this other thing more than the thing that you think you care about.
Anyone want to jump in on that? Oh.
So I don't know that a sort of pro-democracy frame would necessarily say reporters weren't hard enough on Trump. I don't think that that's what it would be. I think it would be that we need to think about the implicit frames that are present that might reward candidates like Trump. Meaning, whether it be the strategy frame or a focus on the spectacle and the rallies and these kinds of habits that are not, it's not, do you know what I'm saying? The difference between saying like, yeah, Trump lied, Trump is bad for all these reasons, versus just paying more attention. Because I'll tell you what, one of the things that I feel like I would love for journalists to recognize is the notion that a lot of times attacks on the press and attacks on their institution are rewarded with more press and more attention. Things like that, where it's like, it's not about like calling it out and being like, this is anti-democratic and bad all the time. It's that there are certain practices that I think largely because of media economics end up rewarded that actually are bad for democracy. That's
sure. I mean, I think when it comes to the horse race thing, I have yet to see any election or media outlet that only covers who's up and who's down and doesn't ever mention people's issue positions. That's a straw man. But it is our job to satisfy readers' curiosity. And the number one thing anybody wants to know about any election is who's going to win. And so we are trying to survey the available evidence and give people a sense of as best we can know because, and I think it's important that we always couch this in a fundamental humility. People get mad at us for not predicting the future as if you don't know that it hasn't happened yet. We're not clairvoyant, right? We don't have some kind of crystal ball that regular people don't. And so I think it's important to always remind people that the future hasn't happened yet and this is just, hunches or evidence or people's guesses and predictions, speculation basically. But people want to know who's going to win. And so, people hate polls, but it's a whole lot better than like wandering into the, King Soopers down the street and asking 5 people and saying, okay, well, they all said they're going to vote for so-and-so, right? It's just a way of talking to more people to get more evidence to answer the questions that our readers are curious about. So should we only cover elections that way? Of course not. But I don't think that means we should not talk about those things.
So I'll say something. When we're talking about a journalist's position with democracy, I think that when we talk about advocacy, I think that journalists are advocates for the truth. They have always been watchdogs. If you ask a journalist, I've done work where you ask a journalist what they do, what they believe, they will say, truth to power, we're watchdogs for the truth. We are advocates for, they won't use the word advocates, but they want to get the truth out, right? Advocates for truth. But if you ask someone, are you pro-democratic? They're gonna say, democracy, right? Excuse me, pro-democracy, they're gonna say, well, what do you mean? Because now we're thinking about politics. And one of the first things you want to do as a journalist is stay as far away from politics in the sense of your position as possible, right? Because we're supposed to be what? The big O, objective, right? We're supposed to be unbiased viewers of the world. We're supposed to put this information out, like even you said it, Molly, put the information out and then let them decide. But I think that when it comes to what we do as journalists, it is okay, and I mean this, it is okay to say I'm an advocate for the truth. And that means that if something is in truth, I may not have to show the other side. And what I mean by that is if something is a fact, which is President Biden won the electorate, right? And he is the president of the United States, which we can break that down to so many different local levels, different races and different stories. There is no other side to saying he won the election. That is a fact. So when you're talking about, taking a position, that's not taking a position. That is a fact. Do we need to hear from people who don't believe that's true? And the same thing with COVID. You have COVID deniers, especially in the beginning when we were all learning so much about this virus. Do we need to hear, if we have health experts saying something, as a journalist, do I need to get the other side from people who don't believe it's true? And I think when we're talking about, politics, I think people get so wrapped up in feeling as if they will look like they are having a position rather than being an advocate or a watchdog for truth and power. And I think if we kind of not just frame it, but if we explain it to people in such a way, then maybe they will be able to receive it a little bit better.
Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, the horse race coverage is sort of least harmful when it comes to election outcomes, right? Because that's what's happening. There's an actual election. But often we see this, big win for Democrats, this legislation passed, right? Rather than big win for, these people who are going to get benefits from this legislation, and here are the details, and nobody wants to read the details. But And the thing about winning and losing is that it taps into such a deep psychological place in people because we just want to be winners, right? We really don't want to be losers. And the fact that all of these identities are now aligned with our partisanship means that when our party is a loser, we feel like a loser in so many different parts of ourselves. It's connected to our racial identity, it's connected to our religious identity, it's connected to all of these parts of who I think I am and my status in the world. All just because my party's losing on the legislation was my party lost. So in that sense, I think the horse race coverage can be really complicating. And one way that I would think about it is to think about journalism more as education. And helping citizens understand what's happening in their government and understand what's coming, right? So this coming election, there's going to be hundreds of different elections happening all over the place. Each one of them could be contested in each state, right? We could have secretaries of state disagreeing with governors, but they're both up for election, and there could be chaos. There could be a lot of chaos in next month. And it would be really great if we had trusted journalists saying, okay, this is the schedule. This is what's going to happen. These are when the votes are going to come in. This is how long you're going to have to wait before you can be certain, so that the conspiracy theories don't proliferate immediately after the elections, and to sort of help the electorate. And I think they did a really good job of this in 2020. Help the electorate understand what's coming and try to sort of inoculate people from the possibility of conspiracy theorizing about elections being stolen and rejecting any elections that particularly the Republican Party loses. And so I think that thinking of it as an educator role, more than just a let's give them what they want to hear, could be a more not responsible, but sort of more productive way of engaging in particularly political news.
A lot of what we've been talking about so far has been about the past. But as you just said, Lily, we have a major election coming up in just about a month and another presidential election coming up in about 2 years. What do we do as journalists? What should journalists do to make sure, or is it our job to make sure that the democratic systems still work? You were just talking about an educational function for journalism. What should we be doing in the field of journalism to make sure that our readers, viewers, and listeners are getting the information they need to make their minds up, and yet not falling into the trap of reporting every election conspiracy theory, reporting on people, as Brian say, giving platform to people who are lying directly to our faces. How do we walk that line? And Denitra, I'll start with you on that one. How do we walk the line between doing our job as journalists and doing our job as American citizens who want to see our democracy continue?
Well, I would say, first, I want to throw this in. The last couple of years have been extremely tough for journalists. And I want to say that it needs to be said.
Amen.
They are constantly being harassed in Trump rallies. They don't want to go. They feel unsafe. And definitely if it's a woman or if it's a person of color, they don't want to be near the story a lot of times because they are being harassed and they are being threatened and they are being sometimes even physically assaulted. With that said, when we're thinking about moving forward and having them cover this work, I would say, first of all, we have to think about their safety. I think that's important. Because when we're sending people out to these stories, sometimes they're even a one-man band or a one-woman band, which means it's just one person with a camera doing the work with all these people around them. So we have to be conscious of how we're sending people out. I think it's very important. But also being able to explain having them be able to explain what is happening. Everyone does not get this training that you all are getting and that your classrooms are getting, which means if they're going out and they're talking about the democratic process, they don't even know how to break it down. And that doesn't mean a person is not intelligent. Of course they are. It just means how to be able to explain and properly report on certain things. And I think that's a huge hole that's not just in newsrooms. Again, I think that's just something that's happening across the board. And then you had another point that I wanted to touch on. I wanted to, as part of your question.
Yeah, what do we do as journalists moving forward covering these next two elections? Is it our job as journalists to provide information to the voters? Is it our job as journalists to ignore the people who are lying directly to our faces?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I was getting all your questions. I was like, because I feel like I had a certain part. But yes, it is their job. It is our job as journalists to tell the truth, right? But also to be thoughtful in how we're covering it. I think every detail, as we've discussed here, does not have to be a part of the story. We think about framing. We think about how who we're putting on. We think about the demographics of the sources that we're putting on television. We think about our audience. We think about the voters, the people who will be affected. Who are we talking to? And not just talking at people, but telling their stories in a responsible way, but also making sure not to shed too much light on when I say too much light, I mean almost no light to conspiracy theories, with the exception of, when I say conspiracy theories, I mean to untruths, right? Without being very clear about it, and being very thoughtful about that, because like we said, we have so many elections going on right now, and they're all contested, and we have a lot of people that are ready to say whatever the outcome is, if it's not in their favor, they're ready to say that it's not true. So I think this is a question that, I don't just have the answer to, that we will all have to put our heads together to really try to think about, because it's going to be a tough next couple of years. Right. And the answer is we will have to continue to put our heads together to see what that looks like.
Molly, I'm going to drag you into this conversation.
Sure. I don't have a global theory of how to fix journalism. I'm just trying to do my job. But I do want to say a couple of mildly provocative things. I think, first of all, as a journalist, I am not trying to make the world a better place. And none of us should be. It's our job to tell the truth. Because once we decide that we are invested in some kind of outcome, we become activists, we become advocates. And that, and this is the same reason that I don't make predictions when it comes to elections. When you think somebody's going to win, I think that shades your coverage in the direction of the outcome that you have predetermined in your mind. And I think that is true for, any kind of policy and for coverage in general. And so, sort of related to that, and also sort of related to the, covering democracy question, it's important that in standing up for democracy, we don't become protectors of bad institutions. Things aren't true just because the government says they are. Mm-hmm. And it's our job as reporters always to be questioning sources of information. So I do feel like I've seen a lot of knee-jerk, the government says the election wasn't stolen and we have to believe that. No, we have done our own investigations and we know, based on our own determination of the truth, but it's important that we don't just revert to, covering for institutions that in many cases are going to be corrupt.
Lily, Dana, you want to jump in on this?
So something that I've been thinking about is the question of just the notion that these things are going to come up because the times are tumultuous. And I would just like to know that journalists and newsrooms have had these conversations and have had to sit back and think about them a little bit, so that when there are actions that are taken, they're reflective, right? They're not just like, oh, this story happened and now I'm going to just cover it. This is how we cover this kind of story. And I think that would involve thinking a little bit about what are our ground rules. And you can say, you don't have like a dog in the fight, right? You don't have a particular outcome that you're invested in. But I do think that there are certain implicit things that even the most objective journalists would say, that behavior of that political candidate, that crosses some kind of a line. Like, for example, if there is a candidate who is endorsing political violence and doing so explicitly, right? I would imagine that journalists would have a sense that like that crosses some kind of a line, and it would probably then be described as such. And maybe it would be described in the sense of like, this is a violation of what most average Americans would consider reasonable campaign rhetoric, for example. But I would just like to know that those conversations are happening, and there is a deliberate reflection on what are our ground rules and what kinds of behaviors of candidates are we willing to characterize as norm violating or not. Yeah.
Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I don't know if we just don't think about it very much, but I think it's just really important to remember that the news media are the ones telling the story of America right now. They're the only ones who are presumably objectively telling that story, and so the only ones that we should even be trusting, or we think that we should be trusting to the extent that we even do trust. And so the way that that the media choose to cover things or not cover certain things can change the story, right? It actually shapes the story as it's being told. And so there's this like this popularism idea that the Democrats have these unpopular policies and that they should run on more popular policies. That actually tells people that Democrats have unpopular policies. That's what they just learned from that headline. And actually, it's not true. Like Democratic Party policies are some of the most popular. Republicans like them if you just ask them about the policies. And so by claiming that something is happening, you just told people that it's happening, even if it's just your theory about whether it's happening. That's not objective news reporting, but even this like analysis work. So I just think it's really important for media to keep in mind that like as they tell the story, they are also writing the story, and everyone who's reading it believes that that's the true story. And so if they leave things out, then those things aren't part of the story of America. And if they put things in, then those things become the story of America and they become reality. And I think that amount of power isn't necessarily like, we don't really respect how much power is involved in being the storyteller.
I had a closing question, but I want to make sure that microphone's open. Does anyone have any burning question they want to ask our panelists? Come, and we'll make that the closing question.
Hi, I'm Alex Rothstein, a junior studying political communication here at SMPA. And I had a question for you all. Where do you think journalists should draw the line between purely reporting the words of political elites, let's say in he said, she said journalism, while also realizing that that could potentially uplift harmful conspiracy theories? For example, I think back when Obama was running for president, and a lot of the media reported the birther conspiracy theories, and they even would use words from, for example, Donald Trump about it. And I think maybe had they focused less on that, it wouldn't have necessarily been one of the larger stories of his run.
Well, I was going to say, so, when we're talking about certain words that are being used and, unfortunately, a lot of times we as journalists, we go for the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, we know the journalistic norms of deadlines and, this is catchy, right? I mean, it happens. I think that sometimes journalists are using those words, putting those quotes on, getting those plays, sometimes even he, in the newsroom, right? Not all the time, but I'm saying in the moment, not thinking about the larger implications that it could potentially have. I think conversations about making sure that we're thoughtful about how to use or not use, right? Because we know framing, we can leave things out. It is our decision. And that's why, as we talk about putting this work out and putting out our stories every day, it is okay to leave certain things out. We need to be having those conversations. Everything that someone says should not make it on. And to give you an example, and I'll tell on myself, I started telling journalists in my newsroom, when I ran a newsroom, to stop putting certain quotes from certain people on. Donald Trump was one of them. And I'll say the reason why is because we were starting to use clips for no reason, absolutely no reason. So then it takes us knowing and paying attention to how this can be harmful and what is the newsworthiness of it, but also being brave enough and bold enough to talk about it in the newsroom, but also making sure that we don't just put it on. Instead, leave it out. And that's okay to leave it out sometimes. And if you do put something in, make sure that we're giving it proper context and being able to explain what it means. And being able to you don't just say that it was wrong, but you explain to the audience in a digestible way why this is not true. So we're basically fact-checking in real time. And actually, there are a lot of journalists who are doing that. So let me just put that out there. I know some really good journalists, including some that I worked with at that time. You put something in front of them and they say, actually, that's not true. And they will tell you why it's not true. But I think in the larger conversation, people need to be journalists, right, need to be really thoughtful of when we use certain terms or certain quotes because they're fancy and shiny, that they have greater harm.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Well, I'll say, you do often hear this criticism of particularly a lot of political journalism that it's just, stenography. That's an important function of political journalism, to tell people what their leaders are saying. And not everything we do is watchdogging and holding people accountable. Some of what we do is just giving people information, being a conduit for information that we have access to and our readers do not. I mean, I think this really became clear during COVID, right? When the hollowing out of so many local newsrooms meant that a lot of people could not get information about COVID rates and COVID protections in their local communities because all the news that they have access to is this sort of nationalized that doesn't give you a sense of the actual picture on the ground. And what people need in that situation is just, what did the governor say today? And yeah, maybe you told a lie and we call that out, but that's not the only thing we're doing as journalists. And I really, and I get that, what it is we select as being important or choose to foreground or what we decide is controversial, those are all complicated and contested decisions. But I do really have a problem with this idea that by platforming certain figures or ideas, we're legitimizing them and giving them currency, and therefore we should ignore things we don't approve of. I think that's a really bad idea, and I don't think that Trump won the election because we paid attention to him in 2016. Birtherism was a phenomenon that was happening in every local Republican precinct meeting. The idea that in this day and age we can still be gatekeepers for information, I think that's just not true anymore. People can get that information anywhere, and they are. And so better for us to be out there trying, to the degree that people trust us, which isn't much, I get it, but trying to say, look, here's something you might have heard, here's something that's out there, but it's not true. I think we have to do that instead of trying to, I remember people saying, stop covering Sarah Palin, she's irrelevant, you're just, it's just clickbait. Well, it turned out that Sarah Palin was a really important precursor to the Trump sort of populist right phenomenon, and she did deserve all that attention. And the reason we were paying attention to her, it got clicks. It got clicks because people were responding to her. I remember going to, John McCain events before he named her to the ticket, and it was like crickets and 5 people in a room, and then all of a sudden she's having 10,000 person rallies. That's a really important piece of information about the American electorate that we are trying to understand and help people understand. I recently wrote a long profile of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you have a lot of people saying, well, stop paying attention to her, that, she's just bad. She is a phenomenon, and she is an important person in our politics right now, both in what she represents and in the things that she is actually doing and moving and, creating. So I think we have to pay attention to all of these things and try to contextualize them for readers, try to help people understand them, but you're not going to just ignore things and have them go away.
Dana, Lily, final words? Dana?
Yeah. So, I mean, if there is an entity that is, or an individual that clearly has some kind of appeal and, is moving people in some important way, that likely is telling a bigger story above and beyond that individual person. So, the idea that, we need to contextualize this and understand, what is the appeal, what's going on, why is this moving the needle in this way for these people? I still think what's important when you talk about the notion of context, what's key is, especially when you're talking about someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, being willing to say, here are the various falsehoods that she's advancing, here are the kinds of things that she's saying that have had, these negative consequences. Using that, like Jay Rosen would suggest, that truth sandwich where here's the truth, here's the thing that they say that is actually untrue, and again, here's the truth, and here's why this truth contradicts what they said. I think that is a challenging pursuit, and I think it's essential, because without that, I think there is a danger of focusing the spotlight without having that context.
Final words?
So I think one thing that we haven't talked very much about is what right-wing media is doing, and our main political news media has rules that they have to follow in terms of verification and truth-telling and figuring things out. The right-wing media don't follow those rules, and so part of this issue of having it's not just Trump saying birther rumors, but it's being parroted on Fox and on Breitbart and all of these news media outlets that have no responsibilities for truth. And in fact, they actively undermine the truth a lot of the time. And so for mainstream political news media to have to combat that but by playing by the rules, right? It's like an unfair game. I think that the only thing is to be able to say, like, this is out there. Yeah, that's what they're saying. They don't have verification for that. There's no evidence for that. We looked everywhere. We haven't been able to find it. Unfortunately, there's usually a backlash, and everyone who does fact checking gets called liberal, right? But ultimately, the fact that there is this huge media ecosystem out there that is not following the rules of journalism means that these stories are already out there, and it is helpful to have some trustworthy voices telling the truth about the lies.
Thank you.
I will tell you one frustrating thing that I read and I see a lot is this organization or this network has not independently verified the story. Then my first response is, then why are you telling me the story? Dana, you had one more thing you want to jump in. We'll have to stop.
One essential piece of this, though, is like when Brian talked earlier about that moment of the Trump feedback loop and observing him at a rally, and then the One America Network reporting on what he said, and then he talks about what he saw on TV, and it was the same thing he said. I think that it's essential that people understand that there is no symmetrical thing happening on the left. And part of the story and part of the facts of the story in the US context right now is that machinery is asymmetrical. And that, to me, is a key piece of the story.
As you might expect, we could continue this conversation for the next 3 hours, and I don't think any of us would get bored. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. How about a great round of applause for our fabulous panel?